All right, you guys, on to section 5 of lesson 10. So far, you've heard about the French and Indian War causing Great Britain to have lots of unpaid debts and new lands to protect. You've read about how that leads to the Proclamation of 1763. The king's way of trying to protect the colonists from attacks, so telling them that they cannot move westward past the Appalachian Mountains. You've read and heard about the Quartering Act, which meant that all colonists were required to provide a place for British troops to stay. They were required to give them space in their own homes. They were required to feed them, give them transportation, and anything else that they would need while they're in the colonies trying to protect the colonists, which made the colonists angry because they didn't want the troops there to begin with. That brings us to the Stamp Act, yet another law that Parliament in Great Britain passes that makes the colonies angry. And that Stamp Act is a law that placed taxes on printed papers. It was not the only type of tax that was placed on colonists during this time. There was the Sugar Act, the Tea Act, lots of different things that the king was placing taxes on. But this is one example that we're reading about today. The printed papers were things like newspaper, pamphlets, marriage license, playing cards, anything that required something to be printed on paper had to be taxed. That paper had to be taxed before using it. And it would be marked with an official symbol or stamp that showed that taxes had been paid for the paper before it was used or purchased. This angered the colonists very much so because they didn't want to have to now start paying money for things that they had always bought before. And now they had to pay more money for it. But it angered them even more, the fact that they didn't have a say in it, that it was the king and the British Parliament telling them what they had to do and what they had to pay taxes for. And they didn't even have a say in any of it. None of the money then that was raised for taxes would be used in the colonies. All that tax money would go back to Great Britain and be used there to help pay off the war. And that angered colonists. So they were paying all this extra money now on taxes for things that they didn't have to pay taxes for before, things they didn't have a say on, and that money wasn't even going to make their lives better in the colonies. This led to a group of people from colonies joining together to protest. Some people would protest by having business owner or merchants not buy any British goods. Other people would refuse to buy British cloth, and the Daughters of Liberty, so women in Rhode Island, would weave their own cloth instead. Another way of starting to act against these unfair laws was colonies decided to send delegates to a special gathering in New York to meet. And they named that meeting the Stamp Act Congress. And here they decided, they talked about how they felt like colonists should have a right to vote, that they should be represented in laws that are being made by people from the colonies who are going to stand up for them and help give them a say or help represent their views when it comes time to making laws. This leads to a very, very famous phrase that we hear over and over again still today. It's very famous, and that is called taxation without representation. This is something that during those times colonists would chant over and over again, and it became a very famous phrase, taxation without representation. They felt like all of these laws were an example of that, meaning that they were being taxed without anybody to represent them to make sure it was fair for them. Colonists became angry, and these protests surprised King George and the Parliament. And they figured out that they couldn't keep enforcing them. So for a while, the British government Parliament and the king took back or repealed the law, but but they made it very clear that they still had every right to keep taxing them on other things should they feel the need. So they again passed other tax laws to try and make money for Great Britain and try and pay back those bills that they owed. And all of those laws or acts were called the Townshend Acts. And like I said, that those included things like taxes on sugar and tea and other products, things that were being imported or brought into the colonies. Things like paper, that we talked about, glass, lead, all of those things that the colonists had become used to having, but now were required to pay more money for when they felt like they didn't have a say in the law to begin with.